It started with a yellow envelope. That's the funny thing about upheaval, it rarely announces itself with fanfare. It comes quietly wedged between a grocery flyer and the gas bill delivered by the same postal worker who always waves at our cat. My wife Ellie found it first. She was trimming the lavender in the front garden when she spotted the envelope protruding from the mailbox, the Evergreen Bluffs Homeowners Association logo, stamped neatly in the corner like a wax seal from some medieval order. "Looks official," she said, handing it to me as she wiped her gloves on her apron. It was. Inside was a formal citation from the Evergreen Bluffs Homeowners Association, signed by the new HOA president, a woman named Karen Whitmore, accusing us of violating community guidelines by repainting our garage door in an unauthorized shade of gray. The fine $325 due within 48 hours. I stared at the notice in disbelief. We hadn't painted the garage in over 6 years. I looked at Ellie expecting confusion, or maybe annoyance. Instead, she just smiled softly and said, "Interesting." Ellie always had a way of making even injustice sound like a math problem, orderly solvable. It came from years of training, I suppose, and decades of wearing a robe heavier than most could imagine. You'd never know it by looking at her. She didn't flaunt anything. No car decals, no framed diplomas in the hallway. Her days as a state Supreme Court justice were a chapter closed with quiet dignity, not celebration. She'd retired 5 years ago and preferred to spend mornings pruning hydrangeas and afternoons reading historical biographies in the sunroom. So when Karen Whitmore's citation showed up, Ellie didn't erupt. She simply brought the notice inside, laid it neatly on the kitchen counter, and made herself a cup of green tea. "Do you want me to call someone?" I asked, already reaching for the phone. "No," she said calmly, blowing gently on her cup. "Let's see what she does next." I had to admit, I was more irritated than she was. Karen had only recently been elected HOA president. From what little we'd seen of her clipboard always in hand, always patrolling the sidewalks in yoga pants and aviators, she had the aura of someone who believed their authority was not just real, but divine. She had stopped by once the week after her election to hand-deliver a newsletter and remind Ellie that our mailbox flag was a bit crooked. Ellie had nodded, politely thanked her, and quietly removed the flag altogether the next morning. But this was different. A fine, based on a lie. I reread the citation. It referenced Section 4.2b of the HOA Guidelines, exterior modifications without prior approval from the board. The problem, we hadn't modified anything. And even if we had, Ellie had actually co-written those guidelines 20 years ago when the HOA first formed back, when it was a helpful, organizing body, not a petty tribunal. The next morning, the situation escalated. Karen showed up in person. I saw her through the living room window, marching up our walkway like she was leading troops into battle. She held a clipboard and a manila folder, her lips pursed in what I can only describe as permanent disapproval. Ellie was already at the door wearing a plain blouse and jeans, her hair tucked back in a low bun. She looked like any other 60-something retiree, enjoying her garden, not someone with the authority to interpret state constitutional law in her sleep. Karen didn't even greet her. "You received the citation," she said. "The fine is due tomorrow." Ellie nodded. "Yes, I read it. I believe there's been a mistake." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Mistake, your garage door is clearly a shade not on the approved palette." I checked. "Then perhaps the palette has changed." Ellie replied, her voice as soft as linen. "Our garage was painted in 2017. At the time, it was reviewed and approved." "Unlikely," Karen snapped. "Those records are digital now. There's no mention of any submission from your property. That would be because the submission was made on paper. The HOA didn't digitize records until 2019. Karen faltered for a moment. Just a second, then recovered. "Be that as it may, your violation stands, unless you want to appeal, which involves an administrative hearing by appointment only and an additional $100 filing fee." I took a step forward, ready to speak, but Ellie raised a hand gently. "Thank you, Ms. Whitmore. I'll look into the appeal process." Karen huffed. You have 24 hours, otherwise we'll be forced to issue a lien notice as per policy. And with that, she turned and stormed off down the driveway, triumphant in her own little war. Ellie closed the door slowly, then turned to me with the faintest smile. "Well," she said, "now we know what kind of president she is." I was livid. "We should fight this. You can file something, can't you?" She threatened a lien. Ellie sat down at the kitchen table and took a sip of her tea, still warm from earlier. "Yes, but not yet. Karen's going to want more. This is just her opening move. You're seriously going to let her push this further. I'm going to let her walk right into her own mistake," Ellie said. "And when she does, I'll be ready." There was something in her tone so calm, so precise, that made me shiver. I'd seen Ellie in court before. I'd watched her deliver rulings that changed state policy. I'd seen lawyers twice her age and 3 times her size shrink under the weight of her gaze when she laid out case law like scripture. And yet here she was, retired, quiet, humming as she tidied up the countertop, waiting for a neighborhood bully to go just a bit too far. "She's going to come back," I muttered. Ellie smiled. "Yes. And when she does, I'll introduce myself properly." 2 days after the initial visit, she returned. This time, Karen didn't come alone. She brought reinforcements. 2 other HOA board members flanked her on the sidewalk, one of them holding a tablet, the other a rolled-up bundle of HOA newsletters under her arm, like legal scrolls. Karen led the procession, clipboard in hand, jaw-tight sunglasses fixed like armor. They stopped at the edge of our property, glancing up at the garage door like it was some sort of architectural blight. It hadn't changed since Ellie picked the shade herself from an original HOA-approved palette, Slate Breeze, I remembered her calling it. But to Karen, it might as well have been graffiti. Ellie and I had just finished lunch. She was folding linens in the sunroom, humming softly to herself. I was washing up in the kitchen when I noticed the trio standing outside, whispering and pointing. I called out to her, "You've got visitors again." She didn't even glance up. Did Karen bring the whole club this time? Looks like the full roster. She smiled gently and kept folding. I watched from the living room window as Karen finally stepped forward and knocked not on the door, but on the garage itself. 3 quick raps with the back of her clipboard like she was serving a warrant. "Persistent," I muttered. Ellie finally walked to the front door, opened it without urgency, and stepped outside. I followed, standing a few paces behind her as she greeted Karen and her entourage with a small, pleasant smile. No hint of irritation, no tremble in her voice. "Ms. Whitmore," she said. Back so soon, Karen didn't return the nicety. "This is your final notice. The board met this morning and unanimously upheld the violation. Payment is due today by 5 p.m. If not received, we will initiate lien proceedings against the property per Article 7, Section 3. She handed Ellie a crisp envelope, stamped and sealed like it had already gone to court. But Ellie didn't take it. She simply looked at it, then back at Karen. "I'd like to request a copy of the meeting minutes," Ellie said calmly, "and the vote tally from your so-called board decision." Karen scoffed. "This isn't a courtroom. We don't answer to every baseless demand from homeowners. The rules are clear. No, they're not." Ellie said, still soft. "Your citations don't match the codes. And the shade you're objecting to was approved by vote in May of 2017. I was there when it passed." Karen blinked. "I've reviewed the records," Ellie continued, still not raising her voice. "They're incomplete. Several homeowner files, including ours, are missing. You're enforcing authority that doesn't legally exist under the HOA charter." Karen tried to interrupt, but Ellie held up a single finger. The gesture wasn't rude, it was refined, quietly commanding. I'd seen that finger stop attorneys mid-objection, and it worked just as well here. "Now," Ellie said, "you've come onto my property to issue a fraudulent lien threat under a citation with no legal basis and attempted to impose a financial penalty without offering recourse, mediation, or transparency." Karen bristled. "I don't need to be lectured." Ellie took one step closer. Her voice dropped half a register. Not cold, not angry measured. "I believe you do." Karen's hand twitched toward her clipboard, maybe out of habit, maybe as a shield. "Look, lady, this is how things work around here. If you don't like the rules, you can take it up with I am the rules," Ellie said. Karen stopped. I saw the moment she registered the shift in tone, the way Ellie's body straightened her presence, expanding to fill the space between them like a rising tide. Then Ellie reached into her pocketbook and withdrew her old ID wallet, worn leather, quietly authoritative. She flipped it open with a well-practiced motion. Inside was her retired judiciary identification card, Associate Justice Eleanor A. Wren State, Supreme Court of Redacted State. Her photo sat beside the gold-embossed seal. Beneath it, the title Retired Full Honors, Lifetime Legal Clearance. Karen went pale. One of the board members behind her audibly gasped. The other fumbled with her tablet, suddenly unable to make eye contact. I served on the bench for 22 years, Ellie said. I helped draft the constitutional amendment that governs this state's Property Rights Act. I've ruled on HOA overreach cases more times than you've probably read your own charter. Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Ellie didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. She simply returned the ID to her purse and said, "You have until 5 p.m. to issue a written withdrawal of the citation, remove my name from your internal enforcement list, and update your records to reflect the original approval of our garage color." Karen tried one last time to bluff. "You don't scare me." Ellie offered a kind smile. "That's good, because fear has no place in community leadership." Then she turned and walked back into the house. I lingered on the porch a moment longer, meeting Karen's eyes. She looked small, like someone who had finally realized they weren't playing a game they were in way over their head. By sundown, an email arrived from the Evergreen Bluffs Homeowners Association's generic account, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Wren. Upon review of the records, we have determined that the citation issued on date was made in error. No further action will be taken. We apologize for the inconvenience. No signature, no accountability." But the message was clear. They wanted this to disappear, quietly. But Ellie wasn't done. She was never one to fight just for herself. This was no longer about a garage door. It was about every person Karen had fined into silence, every family who paid out of fear, every neighbor who thought they were powerless. And now they knew better. The days that followed felt like a strange sort of calm after a storm. Not because the storm had passed, but because everyone in Evergreen Bluffs was suddenly holding their breath. Word had gotten out. We didn't spread it. Ellie certainly didn't. But in neighborhoods like ours, whispers move faster than Wi-Fi. Someone had seen the badge. Someone had recognized the name. By the end of the week, the phrase Supreme Court had echoed through enough backyard fences and book club meetings to cause an unspoken shift. People began waving again when we walked by. The same neighbors who had once stiffened when Karen approached were now slowing down to say hello, asking about the garden complementing Ellie's rose beds. But Ellie Ever Measured took it all in stride. She didn't smile more or speak less. She was simply herself, gentle, deliberate, always listening. And perhaps that's what made it all more unsettling for Karen and her board. Because despite their silence, we could feel their gaze. We'd received the formal email withdrawal of the fine, but no apology followed. No visit. No clarification to the rest of the neighborhood about the error. Just quiet retreat. And Ellie didn't push. Not yet. One evening, I asked her why she didn't go further. "You could have filed a complaint," I said. "You could have had her removed from the board by now." Ellie sat beside me on the porch swing, her tea balanced on the armrest. "Yes," she said. "But if we remove her now, it's about me. It'll look like retaliation." I frowned. And if we wait," she continued, "it becomes about the pattern, the process, the residents, not a power move, but a mirror." I didn't quite understand at first, but I trusted her. I always have. That's when she began her quiet campaign, not a campaign for power, but for clarity. She requested the HOA bylaws under the Open Governance Act. She requested minutes from every board meeting in the last 12 months. She requested the board's financial disclosures public as required, but often delayed under Karen's term. And each time she did, she copied the entire community listserv. No commentary. Just, as a resident of Evergreen Bluffs and a former officer of the court, I would like to review the following documents for transparency and accuracy. The effect was almost immediate. People began responding. One neighbor wrote, "I didn't know we could request that." Another replied, "I've asked about my landscaping fine 3 times." No reply. A ripple had started. Ellie kept each response, organized them into folders, created timelines, highlighted repeated violations of HOA procedure, unannounced meetings, lack of quorum, failure to post minutes unapproved, budget allocations. Meanwhile, Karen went quiet. No newsletters, no patrols, no surprise visits. Until one afternoon, Ellie received a message from a name I hadn't heard in years, John Harriman, one of Ellie's former colleagues from her appellate court days. Now semi-retired, he was volunteering legal oversight for a local civic rights group. He'd heard about what happened from a mutual contact, and he wanted to help. They met for coffee that weekend, Ellie, John, and a woman named Denise Wu, a municipal law attorney who specialized in nonprofit board abuse. I watched from a distance, pretending to read the newspaper while they spoke. Ellie didn't say much, she rarely did in groups, but when she leaned forward and opened her binder, I saw the mood shift. Serious, focused, the kind of conversation that changes things. That night, she came home and set the binder on the table. "I think we're ready," she said. Ready for what? To hold them accountable, not just for us, for everyone. We started small. A petition asking the board to hold a public meeting and disclose all financial activity from the last fiscal year. Ellie wrote it. Tina Alvarez delivered it. Mr. Robert Keating co-signed. They needed 30 signatures to compel the meeting. We got 72. Karen tried to delay it, claimed scheduling conflicts, vacation, and illness in the family. Didn't matter. According to the HOA charter, once the threshold is met, the meeting must occur within 10 business days. Ellie confirmed that clause herself. 10 days later, every folding chair in the community center was filled. Some residents stood. Others peeked through the windows from outside. Karen walked in late, flanked by 2 board members visibly unsettled. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't offer a greeting. Ellie didn't speak at first. She let others take the floor, residents who'd received unjust fines, who'd asked questions and never heard back, who'd watched the community turn from neighborly to punitive. When Ellie did stand, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't mention her title. She didn't wave her badge. She simply read from the HOA charter. Every deviation, every abuse of process, every fine issued without due process or board vote, every dollar spent with no documented approval. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Not in shock, more like awe. Karen tried to respond. She stumbled through a few lines about miscommunication and changes in policy and volunteer burnout, but no one bought it. Ellie didn't refute her. She just sat back down and let the silence speak. After the meeting, people lined up to thank her. Some just nodded. Some cried. One elderly woman whispered, "You've done more in 3 weeks than that board's done in 3 years." I looked at Ellie and saw what I always knew was there, but now others could finally see it too. This wasn't about ego or revenge. This was about restoring a voice to people who had been told to keep their heads down. This was about reminding a community that rules must be fair, power must be accountable, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the most weight. It was supposed to be a routine HOA board meeting. At least, that's how they advertised it. Quarterly review and community updates printed in block letters on the pale blue flyer taped to every lamppost and mailbox in the neighborhood. But by then, nothing was routine anymore. Word had spread like wildfire. People weren't just whispering about what happened in front of our garage. They were asking questions, digging through their own paperwork, rereading old fines that once seemed insignificant, but now felt predatory. And they were starting to wonder if the very institution they'd been told kept their community beautiful and orderly had simply kept them obedient. Ellie didn't plan to speak that night. She told me as much as we got ready, she, in her navy cardigan, simple gray slacks, hair pulled back neatly. No makeup, no fanfare. "I'm not going to grandstand," she said, slipping her binder into her canvas bag. "I just want to be available, in case someone needs clarity." But clarity was exactly what most of our neighbors were desperate for. When we arrived, the community center parking lot was already full. Cars lined the street. People stood in small clusters on the sidewalk, holding copies of their violation notices, their HOA fee records, even printed emails from Karen or her board. You could feel the change in the air, like the current had shifted direction and was no longer in the board's favor. Karen arrived late, again. Wearing a white pantsuit and oversized sunglasses, she walked into the room with a kind of brittle defiance, nodding to a few loyal faces, ignoring the rest. Her two most vocal board allies followed behind, clutching clipboards and folders like shields. Ellie and I sat in the second row just behind Mr. and Mrs. Robert Keating and the Alvarez family. Tina had brought her kids' teenagers, who usually avoided these meetings, but now insisted on coming. "We want to see what courage looks like," one of them had said. The meeting began with the usual dry roll call. Karen read from a script voice, clipped and forced. Then came the updates. Vague mentions of improving communication, streamlining processes, and recommitting to the HOA's mission of integrity and harmony. She sounded like a politician who had forgotten what neighborhood she actually lived in. Finally, she opened the floor for resident concerns. That's when it happened. Tina Alvarez stood first. Her voice shook, but she held her ground. "I want to know why I was fined $200 for having my trash bin visible from the curb when my neighbor across the street has left theirs out for a week with no citation." Karen blinked. "We apply rules equally." Tina held up a photo on her phone. "Then explain this." There was a murmur through the crowd. Mr. Robert Keating was next. He had a printed ledger showing his late dues, 3 of which he had canceled checks for, all cashed within a week of issue. "Where's the money going?" he asked, looking directly at Karen. More murmurs. Others followed, asking about landscaping fees, about an unsanctioned maintenance surcharge that suddenly appeared in last quarter's invoice, about missing meeting minutes. Karen tried to stay composed, but her tone grew clipped, defensive. "All our procedures are within policy. Any errors will be corrected through the proper channels." That's when Ellie stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't bring out her badge. She simply walked to the front of the room and turned to face the audience, not the board. "My name is Eleanor Wren," she said. "Some of you may know me as your neighbor. I served as a justice on the redacted state Supreme Court for over 2 decades. I am now retired, but I remain a resident here, just like all of you." A hush fell over the room. Even the kids stopped fidgeting. "I have reviewed the governing documents of this HOA. I have compared the charter against the actions taken by this board in the last 12 months. I've found multiple violations, not just of your own policies, but of state law." Karen shot up from her seat. "Ms. Wren, this is not a courtroom. You are out of line." Ellie didn't flinch. "This is a civic body," she said, "and residents have the right to transparency, to due process, to accountability." Karen started forward, waving a packet of papers. "You have no jurisdiction here." That's when Ellie calmly reached into her bag and retrieved her badge, not as a threat, not as a spectacle, but as a document of record. She placed it on the podium beside her binder. "Let it rest there in the light." No one moved. "I'm not here to enforce anything," she continued. "I'm here to inform. Your residents are asking valid questions. They deserve answers. If you cannot provide those answers, the state will." Karen stood frozen, not because of the badge itself, but because for the first time someone was speaking with a kind of authority that couldn't be bullied or dismissed. Ellie turned back to the room. "You have a choice. You can demand this board provide full financial disclosures, open its meetings to proper oversight, and re-elect leadership. Or you can remain silent and watch this neighborhood continue to erode behind closed doors." A moment passed, then someone clapped. Just one person, then another. Soon the entire room was on its feet, applauding not loudly, but earnestly, with relief, with recognition. Karen didn't say another word that night. She gathered her papers, walked out, didn't look back. The board adjourned the meeting 5 minutes later with no resolutions passed. But none were needed, because the people had already decided. Ellie picked up her badge, slipped it quietly back into her bag, and walked out the side door into the cool night air. We didn't speak on the ride home. But when we reached the porch, I poured 2 glasses of water, handed her one, and said, "You didn't have to do that." She looked out over the lawn and smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "I did." It didn't take long for the tremors to reach the surface. The very next morning after the meeting, we found 3 emails from the Evergreen Bluffs Homeowners Association in our inbox. Not from Karen directly, but from the generic association address she normally controlled. The first was a limp attempt at reassurance. "Thank you to all residents who attended last night's discussion. The board appreciates your passion and concerns. Please be patient as we clarify a few recent misunderstandings." The second was a notice for an emergency review session closed to the public. The third was a demand that all unauthorized documents and digital files relating to HOA operations be returned immediately. Ellie leaned over my shoulder and read the last line aloud, bemused. "Failure to comply may result in civil penalties." She chuckled, soft and deliberate. They're still trying to sound bigger than they are. But the thing was, they didn't sound big anymore. They sounded desperate. Within 48 hours, Ellie received calls from 4 different residents, each of whom had received sudden notices of overdue fines for infractions that were either ancient or entirely fabricated. Tina Alvarez was told she had parked her car 1 inch too far from the curb. Mr. Robert Keating received a letter alleging he'd installed an unapproved bird feeder. "This is retaliation," Ellie told them. "We'll document everything." And that's exactly what we did. Every new letter, every email, every voicemail from board members trying to clarify past issues. Ellie compiled them into a single folder labeled Pattern of Retaliation Post-Disclosure. The board didn't know it yet, but they were handing her the exact ammunition she needed. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed. Some residents were still cautious, uncertain whether they should take a side, unsure whether Ellie was trying to help or stir unrest, but others, dozens, were reaching out. They showed up at our doorstep with questions, concerns, documents. One elderly woman brought an entire shoebox of old HOA letters. "They fined me for trimming my trees without approval," she said. "But the trees were dying. My grandson is an arborist. He did it for free." We added her story to the growing file. By the end of the week, Ellie had documented over 30 separate cases of HOA misconduct, ranging from suspicious financial penalties to cases where fines had escalated into threats of liens without any supporting paperwork. It was more than negligence. It was systemic. At that point, Ellie reached out to Denise Wu again, the municipal lawyer she'd met with weeks before. Denise agreed to take the case, pro bono, not just for us, but for the entire neighborhood. She helped draft an official legal letter requesting a full audit of HOA records by an independent reviewer as permitted under state nonprofit statutes. They delivered the letter in person, Denise, Ellie, and 3 other residents. Karen refused to accept it. She shut the office door in their faces, so they mailed it certified. 5 days later, no response. That's when Denise filed a formal petition with the County Housing Oversight Commission. Things moved quickly from there. The city launched an inquiry. A forensic accountant was appointed to begin reviewing the HOA's financial activity. The commission subpoenaed the association's internal email logs. Depositions were scheduled, and slowly the fortress began to crack. One board member resigned, quietly, without announcement. Another, a man named Rick Thompson, who had always lingered in the background, called Ellie one night and confessed. She used HOA funds to pay her nephew, he whispered, for security patrols. But he doesn't even live here. Ellie didn't flinch. "Would you be willing to sign a statement?" There was a pause, then yes. She hung up the phone and added his name to the witness list. The momentum was no longer just legal. It was emotional, personal. People who had once tolerated Karen's reign because it's not worth the fight were now seeing her not as a stickler, but as a bully. A fraud. And bullies, Ellie always said, unravel when their audience stops clapping. It was around this time that Karen made her first true mistake. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email, bypassing her usual tone of formal updates, and wrote what can only be described as a tantrum. Certain individuals are weaponizing outdated legal affiliations to destabilize this community. We remind residents that experience in the courtroom does not grant unlimited authority in our homes. The backlash was swift. One resident replied, copying everyone. "You fined my mother $500 for a hose left on her lawn. I trust Justice Wren over you." Another wrote, "If this is how our board responds to legitimate concerns, then maybe it's time for new leadership." By the end of the day, more than half of the residents had signed a digital petition calling for Karen's resignation. Karen responded the only way she knew how. She doubled down. She scheduled a new board meeting. No agenda. No explanation. Just a cryptic flyer on every mailbox. "Protecting our HOA from hostile influence. Mandatory resident briefing." It sounded ominous, like a cult leader trying to rally the last few loyalists before the temple burned down. Ellie and I attended, of course. So did nearly every resident in Evergreen Bluffs. The room was packed wall to wall, buzzing with anticipation. Karen stepped up to the front with fire in her eyes and a folder in her hands. She launched into a diatribe about false accusations, personal vendettas, and misinformation campaigns. She didn't mention Ellie by name, but everyone knew. When she finally paused, Ellie stood slowly and spoke just one sentence. "Shall I read the statute aloud for the group, or would you prefer I email it afterward?" The silence was thunderous. Karen sat down. No one clapped. No one defended her. And in that moment, the balance of power tipped, not with a gavel, not with a ruling, but with the voice of a woman who didn't need to shout. The morning after the hostile influence meeting, I found Ellie in the sunroom, cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by HOA documents spread out like puzzle pieces. The sunlight slanted through the blinds across her pages, casting long shadows on financial summaries, architectural guidelines, and minutes from board meetings dating back 6 years. She was humming softly to herself. "You slept?" I asked. Bringing her a cup of coffee. "A little," she said without looking up. "I dreamed about Section 6.1 again." I chuckled. "That's either the most boring nightmare in history or the beginning of a very strange movie." She smiled, but her eyes were sharp alert. This whole thing, she said, tapping a stapled packet, was never just about Karen being a tyrant with a clipboard. It's about how power becomes invisible, how it buries itself in procedure and ambiguity. She flipped a page. Section 6. "One of the Evergreen Bluffs Covenant," she read aloud, "states that any special assessment must be voted on by a majority of participating homeowners." She looked up. They never held that vote. Not once. And yet, we've been charged thousands in special landscaping assessments since 2019. That was just the start. Over the next several days, Ellie and Denise combed through every line of the HOA's charter, comparing the original articles of incorporation with the revised versions Karen had circulated during her presidency. What they found wasn't just sloppy governance, it was deliberate manipulation. Karen had quietly amended several internal policies, reframing rules to centralize power within the president's office. She reduced board voting thresholds, changed meeting notice requirements, and most damning of all, redefined non-compliance so broadly that nearly any deviation from aesthetic standards could be fined without board consensus. The documents were never filed with the city. Legally, the changes didn't exist, but they had been enforced, on paper, on people. "This is textbook abuse of process," Denise said during one of our living room strategy sessions, "the kind of thing that would get a non-profit board dissolved with prejudice." Ellie nodded. "It's time. We printed everything, organized it into labeled binders, financial irregularities, bylaw discrepancies, signed statements from residents, photos, screenshots, copies of letters, even Karen's own inflammatory emails. Then we requested a special homeowners meeting per the HOA Charter Section 2.4, which allowed any 25% of homeowners to call for a vote of no confidence in board leadership. We gathered double the required signatures. The meeting was scheduled for a Sunday evening. The HOA tried to cancel it, claimed conflicting legal advice, logistical concerns, and even potential security risks, but the signatures were valid. And Ellie had anticipated the move. She filed for injunctive relief. The court ruled in our favor. The meeting would proceed. That night, as Ellie prepared her notes, she turned to me with an almost wistful expression. "You know," she said, "I never imagined my post-retirement years would involve another courtroom." "This isn't a courtroom," I said. It's a community center. She smiled. Same rules apply. When we arrived, the building was packed residents, lining the walls, some standing in the hallway outside. Even a local journalist had shown up after hearing about the growing unrest in Evergreen Bluffs. Karen was there too, arms crossed, face drawn tight. Her allies sat to her left, whispering, flipping through their own printed notes like students. Unprepared for a final, Ellie didn't sit. She stood at the front, laid her binder on the podium, and addressed the room not like a judge, but like a neighbor. I want to begin by saying this is not about punishing anyone, she said. It's about reclaiming our right to be heard. She began with the bylaws, how they were altered illegally. Then she explained the fines, the assessments, the threats of liens. One by one, she laid out the facts, not with fire, but with precision. She let the documents speak. Occasionally, Karen tried to interrupt, claimed misinformation, called it a smear. But each time, Ellie responded with only a page number, a paragraph, and a citation. At one point, a man stood up in the back and shouted, "Why didn't anyone tell us sooner?" Ellie didn't answer right away. She looked around the room, met the eyes of people who had lived under silence for too long. Then she said, "Because they hoped you wouldn't ask." That line changed the air. It wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was a reckoning. When the vote was called, ballots printed and distributed, just as the charter required, the outcome was swift and decisive. Karen was removed by a margin of nearly 80%. Her board dissolved with her. There was no yelling, no chaos, just a deep, collective breath, and the feeling that something heavy had finally been lifted. Afterward, people stayed. They shook hands, hugged, brought over banana bread and casseroles to our house in the days that followed. One neighbor brought wine, another a thank you card signed by more than 40 residents. And Ellie. She never once called herself a hero. She spent the next week helping draft a temporary governance plan until new elections could be held. She met with the city auditor, helped Tina file her appeal for the fines she paid, sat with Mr. Robert Keating to ensure his account was reconciled, and at the end of it all, she returned to her roses. One morning, I found her kneeling in the garden, her hands dusty and weathered, humming that same quiet tune she always did. I stood beside her and asked, "Do you feel like it's over?" She glanced up at me, wiped her hands on her jeans, and said, "It's not over. It's just back where it belongs." The official fallout didn't begin with a bang, but with a certified envelope. It arrived 2 days after the community vote, addressed not to us, but to the newly established interim HOA committee, of which Ellie had quietly declined to be a part. Still, the envelope ended up on our doorstep anyway, passed along by Tina Alvarez, who now served as acting secretary. "It's from the county auditor's office," Tina said, holding it with both hands like it might detonate. Inside, a formal notice of a pending audit and legal review of Evergreen Bluffs Homeowners Association's financial and administrative conduct over the previous 4 years. That meant not only Karen's presidency, but the tail end of the prior administration. What had begun as a movement for local reform was now becoming part of something much larger. This wasn't just about our neighborhood anymore. It was about setting precedent. That night over dinner, Ellie explained the implications to me in the calm tone she always used when navigating complex systems. "This audit won't just validate what we've uncovered," she said. "It'll protect the next board. If there's a clean break between what was and what comes next, the HOA can be reformed properly." "But they're going to come after you," I said. "Karen, the former board members, you know they're not going to go quietly." Ellie nodded. "I'm counting on it." And sure enough, within the week, the first letter arrived, this one from a private attorney representing Karen Whitmore. It was filled with legal jargon, some thin accusations about defamation, and a demand that Ellie cease dissemination of unverified claims. We read it together on the porch as the sun sank low behind the maples. Ellie sipped her tea and said, "Interesting, she finally hired a real lawyer." Denise Wu wasn't worried either. "It's a scare tactic," she said over the phone. "There's no merit. Let them escalate, it only strengthens your case." But Karen didn't stop there. Next came a sudden request filed with the local civil court, an emergency injunction aimed at reversing the community vote, claiming the meeting had been illegally convened and manipulated by a former government official wielding undue influence. This time, Ellie responded directly. She filed an amicus letter with the court citing the exact sections of the HOA charter that governed emergency votes, including her own abstention from serving on the new board. She attached minutes attendance records and testimony from 3 separate witnesses. The court dismissed Karen's petition within 48 hours, but the case caught the attention of a local columnist who ran a weekly piece called Civic Watch. The next issue featured a headline that made me laugh out loud when I saw it at the grocery store. When HOA met her honor. How one retired judge quietly upended neighborhood power. The article was fair, thoughtful, even admiring. It laid out the events, clearly quoting several residents, including Mr. Robert Keating, who'd said, "She didn't raise her voice once, but she made all of us feel heard for the first time." The piece went semi-viral in legal circles, shared across social media, and even cited in a few housing policy forums. Ellie wasn't thrilled with the spotlight, but she recognized the opportunity. She wrote a quiet op-ed in response, nothing inflammatory, just a reflection on the value of clear governance, accessible policy, and the danger of unchecked authority. The county auditor contacted her within days, not for questioning, for consultation. They wanted her to speak formally to a group of HOA boards from across the region as part of a training initiative. They wanted her insight on legal boundaries, fair enforcement, and ethical leadership. She declined the keynote, but she agreed to help draft the curriculum. In the meantime, the audit moved forward. What they uncovered confirmed nearly every suspicion Ellie had raised. Over 2,000 in vendor payments with no invoices or contracts. Duplicate charges for landscaping services. Unauthorized stipends paid to board members labeled as community enrichment. And perhaps most damning, a private fund drawn directly from fine revenue used for emergency board retreats, including flights and hotel stays in Palm Springs. The findings were published in a public report available for all Evergreen Bluffs residents to review. Karen was named explicitly. So were 2 former board members who had since moved away. The report didn't carry criminal charges, not yet, but it opened the door for civil penalties and restitution proceedings, and it allowed the interim board to formally revoke their HOA memberships and bar them from future leadership positions. Ellie was approached about taking on an advisory role with the new board. She declined. "I didn't fight to take power," she said. "I fought to return it." Instead, she helped mentor the new president, an elementary school principal named Devin Marks, who'd lived in the neighborhood for a decade but never attended a single meeting before all this began. "He listens," she told me after their first sit-down. That's the most important part. Meanwhile, the mood in Evergreen Bluffs shifted again. Mailboxes no longer carried threats, but announcements about planting days and potlucks. The monthly newsletter featured spotlights on residents' gardens rather than passive-aggressive citations. The budget was public. The meeting minutes were online. People actually showed up. One evening, Ellie and I took a walk through the neighborhood just as porch lights began flickering on, warm and golden. We passed Tina's house. Her kids were playing catch in the front yard. Mr. Robert Keating waved from his porch, reading a library book in the fading light. A new family was moving in down the street. They smiled at us like they'd heard the whole story and already felt safer because of it. Ellie turned to Amy. "This," she said, "is why it mattered." And I knew she wasn't just talking about a garage door or a rescinded fine. She was talking about the ripple, about how dignity, once defended, spreads, about how silence can be broken, and how something as small as a yellow envelope can awaken something strong and still and unshakable. 3 weeks after the audit report went public, the interim board called a final emergency meeting. Not out of panic this time, but purpose. The agenda was clear: to ratify permanent reforms to the HOA's structure, bylaws, and financial oversight, ensuring that what had happened under Karen's leadership could never happen again. Ellie wasn't on the docket. She wasn't even planning to speak. But by then, her presence was enough to fill the room. The community center was packed again, not with tension like before, but with a buzz of cautious optimism. Neighbors who once ducked behind hedges to avoid clipboard patrols now exchanged recipes and gardening tips. Even the kids seemed freer, unburdened by the tightrope their parents had walked for years. I sat next to Ellie near the front, same spot as always. Her binder rested on her lap, but she hadn't opened it. She looked around the room, not scanning for threats, but absorbing the transformation. Tina Alvarez opened the meeting with her usual grace, though her voice wavered with emotion. Before we begin, she said, I just want to say thank you to this community. We've been through a lot, and tonight we have the opportunity to make sure we never go through it again. The crowd murmured in agreement. Then came the proposals. Devin Marks, the new HOA president, stood and outlined them one by one. Term limits for board members, no more than 2 consecutive terms. Mandatory public notices for all meetings with detailed agendas. Annual independent audits of all financial activity. Resident voting rights expanded to include budget approvals. Elimination of fines without due process. All citations now required evidence, documented reviews, and the right to appeal through a third-party mediator. Each measure was voted on individually. Each passed with overwhelming support, but the last item on the agenda was the one that held everyone's attention. It was a proposal to formally recognize and publicly record the events that had led to the HOA's reform. Not just as a symbolic gesture, but as a permanent entry in the association's bylaws, a written history of how abuse of power was identified, challenged, and corrected. The motion included an addendum titled the Wren Clause, a safeguard that allowed any resident, regardless of board status, to call a public vote if a majority believed leadership had overstepped its bounds. When the proposal passed, the room rose in a standing ovation, not orchestrated, not polite, genuine. Ellie didn't stand. She simply smiled, closed her binder, and whispered, "Now it's finished." But of course it wasn't. Because after the meeting, as people filtered out and the noise softened, a small group lingered near the stage. New residents. A couple who had just bought their first home. A widow who had only recently learned she had the right to appeal her late husband's unauthorized trellis fine. A young man who had grown up in the neighborhood and returned to buy a house near his parents. They approached Ellie hesitantly. Justice Wren, the widow, asked almost reverently. Ellie stood and extended her hand. "Ellie, please." They thanked her, not just for the reforms or the meetings, but for making them feel like they belonged. "You gave us back our voice," one of them said, "and we didn't even know we'd lost it." We left the community center under a wide night sky, the street lamps casting long shadows behind us. Ellie was quiet on the walk home, her steps slow and even. When we reached the porch, she paused before going inside. "I didn't expect to come back to the law," she said softly. "Not like this." "You didn't," I said. "The law came back to you." She gave me a knowing look, half smile, half fatigue. "It always does." "Doesn't it?" I nodded. "When it's needed most." The next day, a letter arrived from the County Housing Commission. They were requesting Ellie's help in drafting statewide HOA accountability guidelines modeled on the Evergreen Bluffs case. She read it silently at the table, then tucked it into her book without a word. Later that afternoon, she stood at the garden's edge, pruning the lavender again, just like she had the day we received that first citation. Only now there was no tension in her shoulders, no watchful eyes. Just sun and quiet, and the soft rhythm of clippers in her hand. And from the street, I watched a neighbor pause, an older man I didn't recognize. He tipped his hat to Ellie as he walked by. "Thank you," he said. She turned, nodded gently, and went back to her work. No speeches, no fanfare, just the weight of silence earned and peace maintained not by force, but by presence. Karen Whitmore's resignation came not with a speech, nor even an official statement, but in the form of a single printed notice posted on the HOA bulletin board near the community playground. It read, "To whom it may concern. Effective immediately, I am stepping down from my position as president of the Evergreen Bluffs Homeowners Association. I wish the community well. Karen Whitmore." There were no apologies. No acknowledgement of the chaos she had caused, Just a dry, impersonal surrender that felt somehow smaller than everything she had once tried to project. But the neighborhood didn't need her words anymore. They had their own. That evening, as the news spread, small clusters of residents gathered on front lawns. No celebration exactly, but conversations that felt freer, warmer. You could hear laughter again, even from the people who'd once kept to themselves out of fear of citations for garden gnomes or wind chimes. The interim board issued a formal statement the next day. Karen's resignation would be honored, and her remaining term would not be filled. Instead, a new election would take place in 30 days under the reformed bylaws Ellie had helped shape. Ellie, of course, declined to run. "I didn't dig a foundation so I could build the house myself," she told Devin Marks, the current board president. "This belongs to the people who live in it." Instead, she helped train the new board line by line, guiding them through the legal definitions they would need to operate fairly and responsibly. Every Thursday afternoon, she hosted informal office hours at the library, answering questions, offering advice, and walking residents through the new community charter like a friendly professor who had once ruled from the bench but now preferred to teach in the shade. Karen, for her part, disappeared. She sold her home quietly within a month. No moving trucks, no farewells. Just a for sale sign that vanished as silently as she did. The woman who once patrolled the neighborhood with her aviators and clipboard now lived only in anecdotes passed around in polite conversations that ended with phrases like, "We should have spoken up sooner." The reforms began taking root almost immediately. The monthly HOA meetings became community events, no longer sterile or hostile. They were held outdoors when weather allowed, with coffee and cookies and actual dialogue. People came not out of fear but curiosity. Engagement became normal. Fines were replaced with conversations, warnings with reminders. Aesthetic violations became shared decisions made with actual neighborly respect. The fines that had been levied under Karen's term were reviewed. Many were refunded. Others were wiped clean. A formal apology letter, unanimously approved by the new board, was issued to every resident who had filed a grievance. It was signed by all 5 board members, including Tina Alvarez and Devin Marks. It was Tina who approached Ellie afterward with a bouquet of gardenias and a handwritten note. "You didn't just help us see the truth, you helped us believe we were allowed to do something about it." Ellie kept the note in her journal. Life moved forward. One afternoon, weeks after Karen's departure, Ellie and I walked the new nature trail that had been proposed by a resident subcommittee. It had once been an overgrown drainage corridor deemed too unsightly by the previous board. Now, with help from volunteers, it was a shaded mulched path lined with benches and community-painted birdhouses. "Funny," Ellie said, stepping over a patch of wild clover, "how quickly things can change once people stop being afraid." I glanced over. "Did you ever think it would go this far?" She shook her head. "No. I thought I'd just have to remind a woman about due process." And instead, Ellie smiled. I reminded an entire neighborhood what dignity feels like. Later that week, a small community newsletter arrived. It wasn't glossy or threatening, just a folded piece of paper with announcements, recipes, gardening tips, and one article titled "What We Learned from Reform." Ellie didn't write it, Devin did. He ended with a simple line: "Sometimes justice comes in robes. Sometimes it comes in silence. But if you're lucky, it comes wearing gardening gloves and sipping green tea." Ellie read it quietly, folded the paper, and slid it into the drawer next to her favorite tea bags. The wind outside rustled the maple leaves she had once planted with her own hands, and in that moment, I knew the neighborhood would never be the same again. Because once you see injustice for what it is, you can't unsee it. And once you stand up, you rarely sit down again the same way. The sky had just begun to pinken with the promise of another quiet morning when I stepped out onto the porch, 2 steaming mugs in hand. One was for me, dark roast splash of cream, and the other, green tea with a sliver of ginger, was already being cradled by Ellie. She was sitting in her favorite spot, the old cedar rocking chair I had refinished as an anniversary gift a few years ago. Her eyes were half-lidded, following the dance of sunlight through the oak leaves as if it were an old song she hadn't heard in a while. The silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't the kind that followed conflict or held its breath before an argument. It was the kind that fills a space where peace has been hard-earned, a silence earned not through withdrawal, but through resolution. She took a slow sip and exhaled. "You smell that?" she asked, not looking at me. I tilted my head. "Lilac's freedom," she said softly, and the corner of her mouth lifted into a smile. It had been just over 3 months since the HOA's emergency election. Karen had stepped down, the board had been cleaned out, and a new set of officers elected by the actual community, not Karen's clique, had been sworn in. There were still rules, yes, but they were rules made with transparency, open discussion, and actual, neighborly intent. Gone were the weaponized citations for mailbox shapes and porch light wattage. Gone were the thinly veiled threats disguised as courtesy notices. In their place came newsletters with updates on landscaping volunteers, invitations to potlucks, and offers to help elderly residents repaint their fences, not because it was mandated, but because people actually cared. Ellie didn't talk much about what happened anymore. She didn't need to. The community did it for her. She'd become something of a legend in Evergreen Bluffs, but not the kind who chased glory. She turned down interviews, ignored the whispers of "you should run for city council," and simply resumed her life. She was above all else someone who wanted to plant herbs in peace. But once in a while, people still came by the house. Not reporters, neighbors. Some brought pie. Others brought questions. They'd sit on the porch steps while Ellie poured tea and told them what she had told Karen. In so many unspoken words, power is not control. Authority is not intimidation. And justice, real justice, often arrives without raising its voice. "I still don't know how you stayed so calm," I told her, watching a blue jay perch on the edge of our newly planted rosemary bush. Ellie shrugged. "Years of courtrooms. Years of watching grown men lose their tempers when they knew they were wrong." She looked over at me, then her eyes bright in that slow-blooming morning light. "The trick isn't having the loudest voice," she said. "It's having the clearest truth." I nodded, letting the words settle. Our porch overlooked the main street of the neighborhood, and from that vantage point I could see small but meaningful changes. There was color again, shutters painted in shades, beyond the old HOA-approved beige kids' chalk drawings on sidewalks. Wind chimes gently ringing from eaves. There was life here now. Not just order, not just control, but actual breathing, unpredictable life. And no one was writing it up as a violation. Ellie stood and stretched the morning sun warming her shoulders. She glanced down at her tea, now half full, and then turned to me. "I'm going to plant lavender next to the porch," she said. "You already have 3 beds of it," I chuckled. "I know," she replied, "but now I want to plant it without permission." We both laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from deep release, from the untangling of months of tension, and the slow, steady return of trust in one's space. A few minutes later, a knock sounded at the front gate. It was Devin Marks, the new HOA president, holding a clipboard, but this time it wasn't about a violation. He had come to ask Ellie if she'd look over a proposal for a new community book exchange near the park. She agreed naturally, not as a judge, but as a neighbor. As Devin walked away, Ellie turned to me again. "You know, there's something beautiful about justice." "What's that?" "It's not about punishment," she said, easing back into her rocking chair. "It's about restoration. About making things right enough that people feel safe again, not just in their homes, but in their voices." The wind shifted, then bringing with it the scent of rosemary and lilacs, and somewhere a sprinkler kicked on, releasing that faint smell of summer. And just like that, the neighborhood that once feared a clipboard now found comfort in a cup of tea.